I was asked, well, it's now almost 20 years ago, by the then British government to put together a national strategy for creative education. And I did that by convening a group of tremendous people who had a lot of expertise in different forms of creative work, or I should say in different disciplines. I remember the then Secretary of State for Education, who commissioned the report, saying to me before the commission got underway that, of course, one of the problems with creativity is you can't define it. And I wasn't being specious when I said, you know, I think the problem is you can't. And I meant that seriously, because if you don't have a definition of creativity, you're led into all kinds of myths and misconceptions about it. There are three related terms which I think it's important to both distinguish and connect when we start to think about creativity in education. The three terms are imagination, creativity, and innovation. You know, they can be used interchangeably, but I think it's wrong to do that, because they do point to different core ideas. Imagination, for me, is where this all begins. Imagination is the wellspring of creativity. So if we're interested to cultivate creativity, we have to begin by stimulating and creating conditions for stimulating our natural powers of imagination. Imagination, as I conceive of it, and I'm not alone in conceiving it this way, but at least let me put a stake in the ground here. Imagination is the ability to bring into mind things that aren't present to our senses. With imagination, you can visit the past in your mind's eye. And interestingly, of course, the past isn't a settled domain. It's why history is such a fascinating discipline. The past is open constantly to interpretation and reinterpretation as we apply different filters to it. But with imagination, you can cast your mind backwards into the past. You can cast it forward into the future. You can anticipate, you can hypothesize, you can speculate. You can't always predict very comfortably, particularly not in the world of human affairs, certainly not as comfortably as you can in the natural sciences, but you can anticipate and speculate. With imagination, you can look into other people's points of view. You can try and see the world as they do. Imagination, for human beings at any rate, is one of the seats of empathy and compassion. It's the capacity to see the world as others might see it, to feel as they might feel. Creativity is a step on. Creativity is putting your imagination to work. It's applied imagination. You see, to be creative, you have to do something. To dwell in your imagination, you don't. You can be imaginative all day long and never do anything. You could be lying in bed, having a wonderful imaginative time, but it may never result in anything in the external world. Creativity has outcomes in the public arena. And the point about creativity is that it is an applied process, and we know quite a bit about how it works and the conditions under which it flourishes. Innovation, then, is putting good ideas into practice. So these three terms, imagination, creativity, and innovation, are central to a strategy for creative education. Now, there are various myths about creativity. One of them is that only special people are creative. That's simply not true. If you're a human being, the powers you need come with the kit. We have immense natural capacities for imagination as human beings, and enormously varied and sophisticated potential for creativity. I say potential because creativity is not just a set of capacities. It depends on a very wide-ranging set of practical abilities, and we don't all cultivate them, we don't all develop them in the way that we might. So one misconception is about special people. It isn't. I mean, obviously some people have particular creative gifts in different domains, but we all have creative capacity. A second misconception is that creativity is about special things. You know, if you ask people if they're creative, very many people will say they're not. And I think it's because what they think you ask them is whether they're artistic. Well, as I say, we can be tremendously creative in the arts, but you can be creative in anything. You can be creative in mathematics, in technology, you can be creative in running or planning a business. You can be creative in cuisine. You can be creative in the way you teach. You can be creative in anything, whatever, that engages human intelligence and imagination. It's not a set of capacities that's limited to one activity or another. So when we come to think about creativity in schools, it's for everybody and it's everything. It's the whole curriculum and everybody in the school. It's not just for a few people that we identify with particular talents. There's a third misconception about creativity, which is it's all about freedom. I was reading an article 2 days ago in The Economist, and they raise this old chestnut that some people who advocate for creativity seem to think it's something that is antipathetic to discipline or learning propositional information, facts and other sorts of propositions. Of course it's not. You can't be creative, for example, on a musical instrument if you can't play it. Now, there are issues of pedagogy here, but I don't play the piano and I can't be creative on the piano. I mean, I can have some kind of emotional release by banging on the keys, but that's not to be compared with the sort of creative work that could be produced by people with a sophisticated set of skills and understanding about how the instrument works and how music works. It's not possible to be, in the end, creative in every way that we might want to promote in mathematics if you're enumerate. So creativity is not the opposite. It's not antipathetic to skills or understanding of particular disciplines. In fact, it depends upon them. And people can become more creative as they become more adept in the skills and media on which creative work depends. And there's a fourth myth, which is that creativity can't be taught. Well, it can. I mean, there's a longer way of putting this, but as time is short, it can. It depends how we think of teaching. If we think of teaching only in terms of direct instruction or conveying propositional knowledge, well, you don't teach creativity in that direct way. But there is very long experience in many disciplines of the truth of the ability to cultivate the conditions under which people can become more creative, to help them develop the skills, the attitudes, the frames of mind upon which creative work flourishes. So let me define. I said that earlier that the Secretary of State thought it was hard to define creativity. It's not easy, but let me tell you how I define it. And this is a definition that came in part through the work of the commission we had in the UK. Creativity, as we define it, is the process of having original ideas that have value. The process of having original ideas that have value. These three things are important. It's a process, it's not an event. Much more often, creative work evolves in the making of it. It's a conversation between the material and the idea, and often the idea that we end up with, or the piece of work we end up with during the course of a creative process, is not the one that we had in mind when we started out. It's an evolutionary process. And it often depends on false starts, on going down cul-de-sacs, on having to back up, on failures of various sorts, on unfulfilled ideas that really didn't take you where you thought they might go. So it's a process. It's about original thinking. Now, it's important to say this too, that it doesn't have to be original to the entire world, but it has to be original at least to you. It has to put your mind into a different shape as a consequence. It would be unreasonable, wouldn't it, to look at the drawings of a 5-year-old child and say, well, we've all seen this type of thing before, or point to the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and say, look, check this out, come back when you've got something worth looking at. It has to at least be original to the person doing it. It may be original to the community in which they work, and of course, it may also be original to the whole of humanity. But it has to have an element of originality about it. And the third element is value. And what this means is that creative work has to have some purpose which is worthwhile. Now, immediately, of course, people say, well, when you say value, whose values do you have in mind? Well, that's the whole point. The first thing is to say that the creative process isn't just coming up with new ideas, it's also applying critical judgments to the ideas you're developing. If you're writing a book or writing a poem or composing a theorem or coming up with a recipe, whatever you're doing when you're trying to come up with something fresh and original, there's a constant process of interrogation which wraps itself around it, saying, is this worthwhile? Is this working